For our COBT listeners and viewers, it's Maynard, Mike, and Gabe Collins here with something we've been looking to do for a couple of months now, and we've gotten lucky. We're going to visit today with Sebastián Arcos. He's the interim director at the Institute for Cuban Studies at Florida International University. As you'll hear, Sebastián was born in Cuba in 1961, lived in Cuba until 1992. He's been an active human rights activist. He's now been in academia. He's obviously lived much of his life in Cuba, but since then has been in the United States. We felt really lucky to connect with the FIU team, and they made him available to us. Mr. Arcos, thank you so much for joining us. We're very excited to talk with you about Cuba, what's happening there, what could happen next, and to get your help understanding all the nuances to everything that's happening. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Well, Mike, before we jump in with Sebastián, what would you add?
Yeah, Maynard, I usually do a market update, but we're going to make it really, really simple today. We're just going to give some stats on Cuba's electricity and energy industries. And just for some facts here, oil production in Cuba is roughly 30,000 barrels per day. Peak oil production was roughly 65,000 barrels a day in 2003. Cuba's oil consumption is around 120,000 barrels. So there's a deficit there of 80 to 90,000 barrels a day that they have to import. The two biggest importers of crude oil into Cuba before these embargoes was Mexico and Venezuela. Venezuela is probably 50,000 barrels of that, and Mexico was 25 to 30,000 barrels of imports. From an electricity generation standpoint, Cuba has 6 to 7 gigawatts of generation. Roughly 95% of that is fossil fuels. And also kind of give you an idea, population of Cuba is around 10 million people. For comparison, Hawaii's electric generation is roughly 9 to 10 gigawatts. That's higher than the 6 to 7 gigawatts of Cuba, with 75% of their generation fossil fuels. But the population of Hawaii is 1.5 million people, so roughly 10 million versus 1.5 million people. So you have Cuba's population is 7 times the size of Hawaii, but Cuba's electricity generation is 30% smaller than Hawaii. So really issues that they need to deal with. So we just wanted to give you those stats to really start the conversation off today.
All right. Well, great. Well, look, let's jump in. Gabe, I think, as everyone knows, works at the Baker Institute, thinking about all kinds of geopolitical issues and helps us with many of those same issues. So he'll be jumping in. Sebastián, I'm thinking about where to start. I mentioned you were born in Cuba, grew up in Cuba, moved to the U.S. You were part of a number of things in the 80s and 90s around Cuban policy. How did this? I think we as energy people understand the current situation to be all about the stress around imported oil, honestly. But maybe that's too simplistic. Cuba's been having economic problems for a while, but can you give us how you think about the current situation and how we got here?
Well, we are at the bottom of a very long slide of the Cuban economy that began in earnest, I would say, 1991, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of a gigantic Soviet subsidy that was sustaining the Cuban economy from the 1960s all the way to 1991. Before the Castros came to power, Cuba was already consuming over 100,000 barrels a day of oil. Cuba was a relatively prosperous economy in the third world. It was so close to the United States, and their economies were very closely aligned. Cuba placed half of its sugar production in the U.S. market at preferential prices. And Cuba became sort of the test grounds of anything that was just made in the United States, from TVs to clothes washers to vehicles. Cubans had sort of the latest that was produced in the United States, and we're used to that kind of good standard of living, combining in many ways the European culture with the American consumer availability of products. That changed, of course.
Can I just make sure we understood you correctly? So the Castro Revolution, so 59, the country was already consuming 100,000 barrels of oil a day,
Yes,
which is the current number. So that's really stunning.
that gives you an idea of what kind of economic development Cuba has achieved since Fidel Castro came to power.
And what would have been the population when Castro took over?
About 7 million, slightly under 7 million people.
Okay.
The country, the population grew. We had a baby boom in Cuba in the 60s. I'm part of that baby boom. And the population grew to about 11 million in the 90s. And from then on, it steadily declined. The latest estimate that we have from demographers in Cuba is that the actual population residing in the island today is 8 million people. So Cuba has lost more than 2.5 million people in the last 6 years.
And the people they've lost in the last 6 years, has it been, are people finding a way to get out of Cuba? Like what accounts for the population decline?
But there's two things happening here. Number one, Cuba has the lowest fertility rate in all of the Western Hemisphere, one of the lowest in the world. So the Cuban population has been declining since the late 70s, actually. The dramatic decline of the last few years came as a result of a worsening of the economic and political crisis in Cuba that led to an exodus. There is no other word to define it, an exodus of over 2.5 million people that left everywhere. There are Cubans all over Latin America. There are Cubans all over Europe. And since 2021, all the way to January of 2025, about 1 million Cubans entered the United States through the border with Mexico during the open border years of the Biden administration. About 1 million Cubans entered the United States. So now we have about 3 million Cubans and Cuban Americans living in the U.S.
And if you don't mind, I mean, all of this is so fascinating. Forgive me, we'll get out of order. But when Castro's death, how important was that as a factor in the decline of Cuba?
It was not significant. His arrival in power in 1959 was really the breaking point of the Cuban economy. By 1961, Castro had nationalized every single U.S. property and foreign property in Cuba. It's still the largest confiscation of U.S. property in history anywhere, over $1 billion of 1961 dollars, and immediately confiscated all Cuban-owned large, medium, small-size property. By 1968, Cuba has become one of the most orthodox Marxist economies on the planet, with not a single private employment in Cuba. And that situation persisted all the way until 1994, when the fall of the Soviet Union forced Cuba to begin implementing some very timid economic reforms in order to readapt itself to living in the world without the Soviet Union.
And how much of what is happening now will help us understand Cuba and the Cuba-Venezuela relationship? Because obviously the Trump administration is putting a lot of pressure on Cuba. A lot of the oil supply that Mike referenced was coming from Venezuela. Like, just maybe talk about that relationship and why
Mhm.
pulling Maduro out of Venezuela has made it harder on Cuba.
Yeah. Well, Cuba doesn't produce much oil, and the little oil that produces is very bad quality, high sulfuric content. It's very difficult to refine. So Cuba burns this oil in their own electric generating capacity. That's primarily the use of the national production of Cuban oil. Cuba
So
depended,
they're using oil to make electricity.
yes, they're using heavy crude to make electricity, heavy sulfuric crude to make electricity. And they have been doing that for the last 30 years, more or less. So they depended entirely on Soviet crude during the Soviet times between the 60s and 1991. And they had a deal with the Soviet Union where they received a very large amount of oil that they would refine, burn, and also put on the market at market prices. So that was part of the Soviet subsidy of the Cuban economy. At some point, it represented about 51% of Cuban GDP in the 80s. It's a gigantic subsidy. Now imagine an economy that suddenly loses an equivalent to 51% of GDP. When the Soviet Union collapsed, Cuba was left without oil and without half of its GDP. The economy collapsed about 40%. So they had to implement some economic reforms in order to survive. And that included a partial dollarization of the economy in the mid-90s to attract remittances from the wealthy Cuban American community in Miami, primarily in Miami. By the year 2000, Chavez took power in Venezuela in 1999. And in the year 2000, the relationship between the two countries became very, very close. And Venezuela filled the vacuum, in part, of what the Soviet Union had left, providing the oil that Cuba needed to run the economy and an additional subsidy that Cuba could sell in the open market for a profit. In exchange, Cuba provided Venezuela all kinds of advisors, and I must use the quotes in advisors. Cuba sent doctors and also sent intelligence and security people to Venezuela in order to make sure that the Venezuelan government would, number one, get rid of its own opposition, and number two, screw themselves into power in Venezuela in a way that would be impossible to get this regime out. Notice that when the United States went in to get Maduro, most of the people killed, or at least a large portion of the people killed, were Cuban security personnel. They were there protecting Maduro, and they were there protecting Chavez before him. And I believe there's still a significant number of Cuban security personnel in Venezuela protecting Cuban interests in that country because they have not been kicked out of the country. They're still there.
When you say Cuban interests in the country, what would that mean?
Well, this situation created by Trump's intervention in Venezuela is very recent, barely 2 months after. The Cubans still hope that the situation in Venezuela can be reverted. And if that happens, they have the personnel there to get the relationship working immediately as it happens. That's why Venezuela is so important for Cuba, not just because once the oil was stopped, Cuba began a a countdown to crisis where we are today, but also because what happens in Venezuela is an important model for the Cuban regime as to what could happen to them. So they're paying attention, very close attention to Venezuela. And since this administration is fixed on Iran now, which is obvious, much more important, I think the Venezuelans are, in the best case scenario, slowly backsliding into what they were before Maduro was extracted. If you think about it, the absence of Maduro hasn't changed anything really significant inside Venezuela, other than a very friendly apparent collaboration with the United States. Everything else remains the same. They are still in control. They still run the economy. They still run the military. They still run the security, and they still keep the Cuban advisors there. Why haven't they expelled all of the Cubans? Why haven't they released all of the political prisoners in Venezuela? Why haven't they started conversations with the opposition that won the elections in 2024? They are not really engaged in a transition to anything.
Can I ask you the flip side of what you just said, which is you just said Venezuela, very important factor for Cuba. But what about Cuba as a factor for Venezuela? Because what we're going to get to here shortly is, what is going to take place in Cuba if that government changes? How does that change the Venezuela equation?
Cuba was fundamental for the Chavez government to entrench itself in power in Venezuela. Now, if Cuba falls tomorrow, that is not going to affect the Venezuelan government significantly, because of the oil that Venezuela can export makes them relatively safe economically. And they've had 25 years to establish their own model based on the Cuban model, which, by the way, was never totalitarian. Venezuela has never reached the totalitarian point of the Cuban regime. That's why it was relatively easy for the US to identify someone like Delcy, negotiate, take away Maduro, and take Venezuela to where we are today. You cannot do that in Cuba. You cannot identify a Delcy in Cuba today. You have to deal with a pretty monolithic, hierarchical, and opaque power structure that has been running Cuba for the last 67 years. It's a completely different animal.
So when we talk about Cuba falling, or what, and you just made these great points about the history of Cuba. What does that mean? Does that imply just absolute chaos? Or how would you, or what does Cuba falling mean in the context of what you just said?
It's not going to be chaos. We're not going to have a power vacuum in Cuba. Falling doesn't mean that everybody gets on a plane and leaves. That's not what it means. It means that we need to get rid of this regime structure and the people who are running the regime at the top, and replace it with someone who can be a caretaker for about 2 years, 3 years max, and who will engage with the Cuban population, with the Cuban exile community, and the support of the United States government in a transition to a full democratic government, beginning with political reforms, not with economic reform. Economic reforms are not enough to change the Cuban model. You need to start at the top. Now, there is no precedent for any totalitarian regime collapsing into a no man's land. Cuba is not going to become Haiti. because 67 of totalitarian rule means that everybody believes that the state runs everything all the time. And you cannot change that mindset from one day to the next. Let's assume that the Castro family picks up and leaves, and the United States inherits some colonel in the armed forces that will be the transition person. The armed forces still control the country, still guarantee sovereignty and national security in the country. There is no power vacuum here. There is no collapse of failed regime that could be taken over by mafias or narco traffickers or pirates like in Somalia, in Africa. That's not the case in Cuba. Whatever transition we're going to get it organized by the same power structure that exists today, only one that has concluded that they have no other choice. They need to engage themselves into a transition. This is called, by the way, transformation. This is not unprecedented. Chile performed a transformation from one type of government to other. Brazil performed this transformation from one type of government. Spain performed this transformation from one regime to another. What Cuba needs, by the way, I don't know if you're familiar with the name, Adolfo Suarez was one of Franco's key men before he passed. After he passed, Adolfo Suarez engineered a peaceful and fast transition to democracy in Spain alongside the King of Spain. We don't need in Cuba a Delcy Rodriguez. We need an Adolfo Suarez, and I hope we get one.
So there was so much in there. I got to get Mike and Gabe to jump in with their questions, but maybe one more for me. Because when you were talking about countries, this sort of seems perhaps it's a good analogy, like what happened in Eastern Europe. A number of countries had totalitarian, communist governments, and then they started toggling back towards capitalist democracies. If you're the U.S. right now, you're trying to trigger, you're trying to get Adolfo Suarez, whoever he or she is, to take the keys, and then do you lean in and say, okay, we're going to stop the blockade, we're going to get you energy, but we need the following guarantees? Like how would this work if you're trying to really help the people of Cuba?
Yeah, well, assuming that we can find an Adolfo Suarez in Cuba and start working with it, from that point on, it's not particularly complicated, because a person like that would start working with the Cuban opposition inside the island and outside the island. And he will get two things that are fundamental. One is political legitimacy, and the other one is support to commence that transition. If that transitional figure makes a pact with the Cuban opposition inside and outside the island and gets that support, that legitimacy from them, remember, they are the canaries on the coal mine that can tell the United States and the world whether or not a transition is actually taking place.
So when you say that, Sebastian, you're talking about kind of the Cuban American community, right?
The Cuban American community and the Cuban opposition inside Cuba. There is opposition in Cuba. It's very much repressed, persecuted, and many of them are in jail, but they're there.
Okay.
And they need to have a place at the table to make it legitimate. Not just the Cuban exile community, which is very anxious right now, waiting for that moment. And it's getting organized economically. There are billions of dollars ready to go in investment to Cuba, and it's getting organized politically with a sort of a transition map that is very general, but very clear in the sense that it demands political changes first and economics as second. Before the money can flow in, we need to change the framework, the rules of the game. Otherwise, these people are going to steal the money the same way they steal the money of every investor in Cuba in the last 30 years. You mentioned the European countries that transition. Those are important in many ways because he proved the point that I just made. There were two models of transition in Europe. Eastern Europe, Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and the Central Asian countries engaged in economic transition before changing the politics.
Yes.
Central Europe, Poland, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, engage in political transition first before engaging in economic transformation. And we can see the difference 30 years on. Those who engage in political reforms first today are full members of the European Union and full democracies, and they have prosperous economies. Those who delayed the political transition are still stuck in autocracy.
Very interesting.
That's the model for Cuba. If we do the same thing here in a totalitarian tropical Cuba, we're going to get the same results. So the Venezuelan model is not what Cubans are looking forward to.
Yeah, Sebastian, maybe just a step back and maybe talk about the current power structure. I mean, it's Diaz-Canel is the only guy that's not had the name, Castro running Cuba since 1959. And so he's there, he's running for re-election in 2 years, I believe. But the de facto ruler is still probably Raul Castro, right? Some are saying that his grandson, Raulito, is sort of the go-between right now between the U.S. and what's going on there. Maybe kind of give us an idea of who is in the power structure. Who is that Suarez type guy that might rise to the top? Would it be a Castro? What are your thoughts on that?
Okay, that's an important understanding the power structure in Cuba. It's fundamental to engaging in these conversations with the regime. Totalitarian regimes are very hierarchical. So they have usually one ruler and only one ruler at a time. Think of the Soviet Union with Stalin, then Khrushchev, then Brezhnev. It was very structured. They are extremely obsessed with absolute power. So having very clear decisions made at the top, always from the top down, is fundamental. And they exert control over every aspect of society. So think of a country where everything is run by the state. When I say everything, I really mean everything. You cannot have a social club without the state being the leader of the social club. It is unthinkable in a totalitarian society. So what Cuba got with the Castros was a two-headed monster. In the Soviet Union, you got Stalin, and then the other one, the other one, the other one. It's usually the way it goes. In China, you have Mao, then you have Deng Xiaoping. Now we have the new Mao with Xi. In Cuba, in 1959, we got a two-headed monster. Fidel Castro was the most important head, but Raul was always the secondary head, always. Since 1953, when they went and attacked the Moncada barracks in Santiago de Cuba, Raul was the second head. And very early on in 1958, Fidel Castro made it very clear that Raul was his second in command. and has been all these years in charge of the armed forces, second in command. So once Fidel died, instead of a shock to the system like the Soviet Union got when Stalin died, we got more of the same. Raúl was there ready to take over. It was a very smooth transition. Nothing changed. Nothing economically changed. Nothing politically changed. Now, Raúl, in 2008, when he became president and first secretary of the party, the two things go together. Raúl began to change the image of the regime without actually changing the structure of the regime. So he created this sort of a front government that it was civilian, it was led by the party, it was led by a younger face, Miguel Díaz-Canel, who was not a Castro, and is now president and first secretary of the party, but he also has a prime minister. And it looks like a modern open society kind of government, but it's hollow. That doesn't exist. That is just a front. The real power is Raúl Castro, continues to be Raúl Castro, even though he has retired and has no official position. He continues to be the paramount leader. Now, you don't have to believe me. Go and listen to Díaz-Canel's presentation before the Political Bureau last Friday. He begins by saying, with the leadership of our historical General Raúl Castro. He begins by mentioning Raúl Castro. It's very clear who's running the show. Very clear. Díaz-Canel is just a face, a different kind of face. Now, Raúl Castro not only changed that power relationship and appearances in the government, he also gave all the power, transferred all the actual power to the armed forces. His child, Fidel Castro, was always the mastermind of diplomacy and intelligence. Raúl Castro was the head of the armed forces, the man that made possible that Cuba send an army to Africa and beat the South Africans in the 80s. It was Raúl Castro. So he turned the military, the Cuban armed forces, into the power in Cuba. They run the economy. What we see beginning in 2008, all the way to, I would say, a climax in 2017, is a complete takeover of the armed forces of the Cuban economy. All the hotels, all the export industry, all the import and export, all the financial transactions run through the military. There is this corporation in Cuba called GAESA, which is run by the military, that is essentially the power behind the throne, and is controlled directly by Raúl Castro. And his grandson, Raúlito, is a very influential man in that connection. That makes him relevant to the equation. Also because obviously he enjoys the trust of his grandfather. But he could not be the transitional figure because it's more of the same. You know, we have a saying in Cuba in Spanish, el mismo perro con diferente collar. In English, it would be equivalent to say same dog with a different collar. That's not going to hunt. That dog is not going to hunt for Cubans. That's not regime change. So the structure as it is today, and it's by design, very opaque, so we cannot identify who in that military structure can be the person we need to be talking to. They're not going to let us find that person. it's going to be very difficult to find that person. But if we crack the regime, if we shock the regime, like the death of Stalin or the death of Mao, then we open up the possibility for an unknown figure to rise up and become that transitional person. It's not guaranteed. In many ways, it looks a lot like what we're trying to do in Iran today.
Excellent. So, Sebastián, I want to explore a bit more thinking about alternative power structures. You've talked about the opposition outside of the island and on the island. To what extent do they talk to each other, and to what extent are there relationships, if at all, today? And the reason I ask this is it seems like the people on the island would supply the political legitimacy, but the capital and the business expertise would likely come out of South Florida and other places where we have the diaspora in the United States. I was wondering if you could speak to that.
Definitely the capital is in the exile community in the United States. Now, political legitimacy exists in both sides of the Florida Strait. The Cuban opposition operates as one, inside and outside. There are groups that have representatives outside, and there are groups outside that have representatives inside. This is not, keep in mind, as it did in Venezuela. Venezuela had a much more fluid opposition that was able to get organized and win an election. This is unthinkable in Cuba today. But the conversation between the inside and the outside opposition is fluid. It exists all the time. And at least since the mid-90s, the outside opposition is constantly supporting the inside opposition financially, morally. That's an important support that cannot be understated. And also by becoming sort of the voice of the opposition for the outside world. Cubans in the opposition can rarely travel out of the island. So Cubans outside the island are the ones that travel all over the world, including the European Union and the United Nations, to tell the story of what's going on inside Cuba. So the connections are very strong. And I have witnessed the rise of what I call the Miami consensus. And I can tell you that it matches what it could be a Cuba consensus coming from the opposition inside Cuba. I was once there. I know how it works. And I know many of the characters that are still inside Cuba working on the opposition. What the Miami consensus is, essentially, is what I just described when I discussed the transitions in Europe. The transition must be full to democracy. It cannot be stopped halfway. And it must start with political transformation, opening the way then for economic reform and economic recovery. That's the Miami consensus. And I have seen the consensus operate in the business community in Miami, where the money is, where the capital is, and also in the activist political side of the Cuban American community, those who are in constant communication with people in Cuba and who in many ways represent people in Cuba. Now, it's not as simple as it was in Venezuela, where the opposition was inside and the main leaders were inside and the people outside were just working as the speakers' voices of that opposition inside. This is not the case in Cuba. You cannot organize an opposition like Maria Corina did in Venezuela, in Cuba. So that opposition, in the case of Cuba, is much better organized outside than it's inside. But it's ready to step in. And it's important because of the peculiarities of the Cuba case. It's important that both have an equal place at the table when the time comes to negotiate a transition. Because even though they agree on the main goal, which is we need to end this regime and bring democracy back, there are ideological differences on both sides that need to be reconciled. And for legitimacy purposes, it's important that both the internal and the external have representatives at that table once the moment comes for that conversation. Because these are people who stayed in Cuba and continue to suffer harassment and prison and persecution versus people who left Cuba and are able to live more free lives outside of Cuba. And again, I was there and now I am here. So I can tell you both sides of the coin. They need to become one, and they will eventually become one. Once we get to the point that there is a possibility of creating what in Poland it was called the round table, sitting the Communist Party and the Polish opposition. And out of that round table came the first free elections in Poland, and the first free elections actually in any communist country in Europe at the time, in 1988. It was almost a year ahead of the collapse of the Berlin Wall. We need to have that kind of round table in Cuba eventually. The government will have a seat now, the regime will have a seat at that table if they are willing, and the Cuban opposition will have a seat, the Cuban exile community will have a seat, the United States will have a seat. And then we can get to an agreement of how quickly we are going to transit from this regime to a full democracy. There is no other solution that will guarantee the national security of the United States and at the same time, the freedom and the welfare of the Cuban people. This is the only one that can guarantee that, both.
What makes the government want to transition? And the reason I ask this is you think about this economic and political reform sequencing question that you've described. And in the context of what we're seeing now with the blockade, we've seen in so many other cases with sanctions and embargoes where even if the population has to bear horrific suffering, the regime is usually able to protect itself. What in the case of Cuba, maybe short of an outright physical U.S. intervention, gives the regime an incentive to actually come to this roundtable you describe or something like it and actually start a real meaningful political reform conversation?
That's where we are now. That's probably the most difficult of all the phases. First, they need to understand that they have run out of time. It doesn't matter if you are the elite in a country that cannot run because it doesn't have fuel. What's the point? If you're there for ideology, there are very few people, I think, in Cuba that are there for ideology. Most of them are there because it's good for business at the elite. They're making fortune because they hold a monopoly on all kind of commerce and trade in Cuba. So they're making money. They can continue making money until a point where Cuba cannot export, cannot produce, cannot do anything. How are they going to make money? No tourist is going to go to Cuba in the next month. How are they going to make their money? Then, if they're not making money, what is the purpose of opposing the United States to remain in power? What for remaining in power? I guess that's the whole idea behind this fuel quarantine. Force them to reach the point where they realize that there is no way out other than a negotiated solution that leads to a transition to democracy. The United States is just pointing to the only one exit is that one.
Can we ask you,
Now,
Sebastian, about,
yes,
can we ask you about two other players, two M's, Marco Rubio and Mexico? Tell us how important Marco Rubio is in this. He's obviously super important, but what is his role?
Yeah.
And then also just tell us about Mexico, because for a while they were a wild card. Maybe they were going to give oil. You know, Mike mentioned they've been a source of help. Talk to us about those two variables.
let me start with Mexico because it's easier. Mexico was a wildcard at some point in January when the strategic situation changed dramatically after January 3rd. And I was personally concerned that Mexico was going to try to replace Venezuela as the new patron of the Cuban Revolution. That didn't happen. And it didn't happen very quickly. I don't know, I can't tell if there were high-level conversations between Mexico and the United States, but very, very quickly, the Mexican president, who is a socialist, but at the same time is also a very pragmatic person, decided that it was not a good idea for her government, let alone Mexico as a nation, to pick sides between the Cuban regime and the United States, its main trading partner. I think that was a very easy and wise choice. So she decided to abide by the United States decision not to sell or gift any fuel to Cuba. So they're now sending humanitarian aid. Mexico has a long tradition of sort of being in between the United States and Cuba. In Cuba, they call it, the eternal solidarity of our Mexican brothers and sisters, something along those lines. And Ms. Scheinbaum, because she is a socialist herself, would like to extend a hand to the regime, but she is in a very difficult situation. She's not going to do that. Mexico will not come to the rescue of the Cuban regime. Marco Rubio is key because he is Cuban American. He knows the story. He grew up in this town. He knows instinctively all the little nooks and crannies of the Cuban history and the long relationship between Cuba and the United States, and what the Cuban Revolution means, and what the exile community means and believes in. I call him the Trump whisperer. He's the one that can whisper in Trump's ear, this is not such a good idea to apply the Venezuelan model to Cuba because they're different animals. He's the only one that can communicate that to Trump. And perhaps Trump will say, you're right. Perhaps. I'm not so sure myself. Perhaps. But if anybody can do it, it's Rubio. And he also understands geopolitics very, very well. He's not necessarily the perfect MAGA fit for that position as Secretary of State and National Security Advisor. And that's the best thing about him. Trump listened to him, and he comes with a baggage of a Reagan Republican about geopolitics and the importance of using the United States weight to make good things happen in the world. Not just build fences and retreat to our inner fortress, which is the MAGA conception of international politics. I think Rubio has been a very beneficial influence on Trump. And all Cubans are here, crossing our fingers, hoping that he will be he will give Trump the right advice and that Trump will listen to it.
Yeah, I think one of the things I've been hearing lately is assuming something really positive happens in Cuba, we get a new government and democracy. One of the issues I keep hearing brought up is just the confiscation of property of businesses and how those are resolved. Assuming like everything goes greatly in the next year or so, how does that get resolved? And is that an impediment to really get things moving along economically, financially?
It is definitely an impediment because everybody who understands an open economy realizes that without clearly defined property rights, the economy cannot take off. And most Cubans understand this reality. It's a very complicated issue that must be resolved with by a democratically or politically legitimate government. It cannot be solved by decree by a transitional figure. It must wait for an elected government in order to be resolved. And it will take time. There are a little over, or not, maybe not so much a little, more than 5,000 acknowledged registered claims for property in Cuba. Some of them are being litigated right now. Some others are just waiting there for the moment when they will have to be litigated. But again, it will have to be with a legitimately elected government in Cuba because it needs to have that kind of legitimacy behind it. And it must be very transparent. Cubans are very aware of this issue, but I think there is some flexibility in the Helms-Burton Act that allows for the U.S. to lift most, if not all, of the sanctions once there is that legitimacy projected in a government in Cuba, and then proceed with the clearing of those property issues that will take necessarily a number of years.
I guess my question builds on that. I'll refrain from offering my lawyerly thoughts on ways to de-risk some of these things, and I'll ask you maybe a structural economic question instead. And that is, let's be optimists and say, okay, we have a period of maybe 6 or 12 months where things start to really get on the right track with governance in Cuba. What are some of the sectors where you think there would be the most investor interest and activity if that were to happen?
The most obvious one is tourism. Cuba is a beautiful tropical island in the Caribbean that has been underinvested and underdeveloped. It has one of the most pristine coral reefs in the Caribbean. So that's pretty obvious. Actually, the Cuban government bet during the Obama engagement and a little actually before the Obama engagement, but most heavily after, bet that building hotels was going to be the key to their economic survival because the island will be flooded by American tourists that will continue to go in growing numbers, and then the regime will be able to solve the economic equation of Cuba. It didn't pan out because Trump came and ended the opening, and there were no more American tourists going to Cuba. Even the Canadians, who by 2019 reached a point of about 1.3 million per year. Last month, they went down to less than 800,000. And I think very few Canadians are still remaining in the island. They were all pulled out of the island by Canada about 2 weeks ago. So that industry is an obvious target. Cuba has significant sources of lithium and nickel and cobalt that will definitely be important for the new electric battery economy and aerospace and all that. It's been in the hands of a Canadian company for the last 60 years. It used to be in an American company that invested in MOA in Eastern Cuba. And I think that should be quickly developed into, its full potential. I honestly don't know what the full potential of that industry could be. And then there's manufacturing and services. Cuba could become, in many ways, the place where you go manufacture all kinds of things for the U.S. market. Sort of the maquila model used in Mexico many years ago, which at the beginning might be controversial, but eventually it generates employment. And that's one of the things that Cuba needs first. Employment, jobs. We need to create jobs for Cubans that they want to stay, they want to go back to the island, and they can build up their lives based on those jobs. And the service industry could be huge also in Cuba. Cuba has a very, I'm looking for the word, creative labor force. Cubans have been forced by 60 years of totalitarian regime to become creative and invent all kinds of things, including, by the way, in the new electronic age. Cubans are masters at connecting cell phones with Facebook in a country where there is no power and no Wi-Fi. So that gives you an idea. In many ways, watching the Ukrainians become the leaders of the drone military use by being creative because they have no other choice. I'm thinking of the Cubans will be able to do the same thing in many ways. That creativity that is forced by the circumstances they live in would eventually benefit the country economically.
So, Sebastian, this has been tremendous. We're kind of getting to the top of the hour. You've been very generous with your time, and you didn't know us. We just tracked you down and said this looks like a great guy to talk to, and that was the right judgment.
Thank you,
guys. Can we ask you though? I think sometimes watching this and watching some of the footage lately there's been some rioting and there's been problems. Do you think this is an imminent thing? Is this something that'll play out over the next 6 months? Like, how close are we, in your judgment, to a real change?
That's a key question. It's not imminent in the sense that it's going to happen next week, but it cannot take 6 months to unravel, because then the United States will have a full-blown humanitarian crisis blow up in its face. And that's exactly what the administration is trying to avoid. The Cubans are already blaming the United States for the crisis. I've had reporters telling me that, oh my God, Cubans are dying because of the blackouts that began 2 months ago. Sorry, the blackouts began 7 years ago, not 2 months ago. This is not new. It just got worse in the last 2 months, dramatically worse. And that's the whole point of the policy, to make it evident for the regime that there is no other way out, that they cannot just keep coasting the way they were before. So the window is narrow. It's like the Apollo 13 coming back to Earth. It's a narrow window. We need to just put it in there. But the next few weeks will be key to understand who the players are and what kind of game is the administration playing, the U.S. administration playing. Because they have the cards, to use the president's metaphor. Trump has all the cards. And depending on what card he's willing to play, I think is how fast or how slow this is going to move. I can bet you the Cubans will play for time. There's no question. They're already doing it.
Can we ask you as we wrap up what card you'd play if you were the president?
I would play the Iran card. If you don't move, we bomb. And as long as you don't move, we keep bombing. Cuba is not Iran. It's a much smaller country and it's very close to the United States. We don't need to move 2 aircraft carriers halfway around the world to do this. In military terms, it will be much easier. We just need to remind the Cuban regime who holds the strategic high ground here. And that obviously will be the United States. We can start taking some obvious targets, and then if they don't move, we can proceed and take other targets. I'm not talking about boots on the ground. Absolutely no need for that.
Do you have, I keep trying to let you go, but it's fascinating. I'll just do one last one. Is there a scenario, or how probable is it that the Cuban regime survives? If we're sitting here in 2 years and they're still in power, like what are the chances that that could happen?
Unfortunately, there is a chance that they can survive. If Trump doesn't play the cards, the full Monty, the full card, and his transactional nature comes out, takes over, and he is willing to accept a halfway transition, meaning a regime that is more friendlier towards the United States, kicks out China and Russia from the listening stations in Cuba, but continues to violate every social and political and economic right to the Cuban population, then they can survive. Again, it depends on how far Mr. Trump wants to go down this road. I can tell you that Cuban Americans are not going to be happy with that halfway solution. They're not. There's a feeling in Miami that this is it. This is the one chance that we have to make it happen. And we have to make it right and take it all the way. It's not easy, but it's like gangrene, and you have to cut off the limb in order to save the body. This is the moment.
It is interesting. You had the parallels of the one regime in Iran, 79 to present, terrible conditions, and an international community that is seemingly elated and hopeful and hoping for change. And you have something similar in Cuba. If you'll forgive, you're obviously a great historian, so I'm trying it on you. 59 instead of 79, but the same kind of thing, a community internationally that is watching and hopeful. And these are two regimes that people, I don't know, I think would have guessed there's very little chance that you ever change it. And here we're on the threshold potentially of changing both.
Yeah.
But
You will be surprised at the parallels between Iran and Cuba. I have a list, and if you're willing to go on another show, I can show you my list. It's surprising, the parallels between the two countries.
Well, this is so important. Can we just take a couple more minutes and talk about that list?
Sure. Why not? Think about it this way. They were both modern nations, westward-looking nations.
Mm-hmm.
Then they had a tyrant come in, the Shah in Iran, Batista in Cuba. And they had a popular revolt against those tyrants. a popular revolt that was hoping to gain more freedoms in both countries. Those revolts eventually managed to win and kick the dictators out, but then they were hijacked by these characters, Khomeini in Iran, Castro in Cuba. And instead of democratic revolutions, they became one a Marxist in Cuba, another one a theocracy in Iran. And they both made the United States the Satan of the world, the personal enemy, historical enemy of their regimes was the United States. And they directed all the vitriol and all their forces to combat, to fight the United States everywhere in the world. Cuba intervened in Africa and Latin America, in Vietnam, everywhere. The United States was fighting, Cuba was fighting on the opposite side. The same as Iran. They based their leadership on a character that became the symbol of the regime. They both have beards to begin with, and they both represented the ideals of the fights that they were taking to the United States. They both built their own security and military forces, not only into powerful military machines, but also to export revolution and unrest to other countries, Cuba in Latin America, Iran in the Middle East. And they also made them important economic actors within the government. Iran's revolutionary corps, Cuba's armed forces. And now they are both facing a United States that has decided that it no longer can wait for them to engage in regime reform on their own terms, but is now pushing them to force regime change because it got tired of the waiting game. So here we are. The parallels, believe me, are surprising.
No, that was fascinating. Well, this has been so interesting. We knew it would be, and you've stimulated our thinking a ton. And so we just owe you tremendous thanks for spending this time with us and helping us understand it better.
My pleasure. And thank you for your invitation.
Absolutely. Well, come see us in Houston. We'll be watching this closely, and please reach out as you think there's something we should know.
Anytime.
Thank you.
Anytime.
Thanks, everybody.